I still have the message from that day. It came through just as the nurse pulled the chemo 4 from my arm. Meet me in room 3B at 10 a.m., Ron. No. How are you feeling? No. Hope you're recovering well. Just 9, words cold and clinical, like the scan results I had just shoved into my jacket pocket. My name is Walter Kane, and I'm 58 years old. I spent nearly half my life building the Western Division of Glenmore Uniform Solutions. What started as a tiny supplier became the go-to uniform provider for hospitals, school districts, and restaurant chains across the Southwest. I didn't have an MBA, I didn't speak in buzzwords, and I sure as hell didn't use terms like synergy or quarterly alignment. What I did do was show uperly, late, whenever it mattered. I built relationships that lasted longer than most of our contracts. I made promises and I kept them. They didn't fire me in a formal review or a year-end meeting. No, Ron Jaspers, the newly minted CEO who had barely been around 3 months, ended everything in just 7 minutes. We're restructuring to better align with market realities, he said, without even looking up from his laptop. We appreciate your contributions, Walter, but your role is being eliminated for effective today. No handshake, no thank you, not even a passing question about whether I was still throwing up from chemo, just a severance form and an offer to escort me out with dignity. I walked out of that building, the one I'd entered nearly every morning for 16 years carrying a single cardboard box. Inside, a crayon drawing from my granddaughter, a pen gifted to me by our Midwest director after the 2011 turnaround, and a name badge whose print had faded from 2 decades of use, but I had never once removed. Driving home, the morning news played on the radio, but I couldn't hear a wordly Ron's final sentence echoed. We need someone better aligned with our digital strategy. They didn't say it outright, but I knew exactly what they meant. I was too old, I was battling cancer, and in their eyes, I was no longer worth the investment. But what they didn't realize is that when you strip a man of everything, the only thing left is honor. And if there's one thing I understood better than anyone at Glenmore, it was this: trust can't be digitized, and loyalty doesn't fit into a spreadsheet. When I joined Glenmore in the spring of 2007, they weren't a company anyone had heard of outside a few counties in northern Arizona. Their Western Division, if you could even call it that, operated out of a converted auto garage behind a shuttered Sears in Mesa. We had flickering lights, second-hand desks, and a shipping schedule built around whoever's pickup truck wasn't in the shop that week. And yet, I saw something in it, something worth building. Maybe it was the people. Maybe it was just a gut feeling. But I said yes. Back then, my job wasn't about titles or budgets. It was about survival. We had 9 employees and a directive from the board that boiled down to one line: fix it or we shut it down. So I drove every day, every week across New Mexico, Utah, Nevada, and the dusty corners of Texas. I met with school district superintendents, hospital administrators, and restaurant franchisees in break rooms and parking lots. I really listened to what frustrated them about our competitors. Shipments that arrived late, orders filled incorrectly, no accountability once the contract was signed, and then I fixed it. I standardized inventory checks, reorganized fulfillment, and created a direct line from every major account straight to my desk. I memorized the names of client spouses, their kids' birthdays, even which golf course they favored for weekend tournaments. I didn't see them as accounts. I saw them as people who trusted us, and I treated them that way. As the division stabilized, we moved into a modest 2-story office in Glendale. I handpicked every hire, not based on their resume, but on how they handled a tough phone call or how they looked someone in the eye during an apology. I promoted Lisa Tran from reception to key account management after I saw her calm a furious school administrator whose shipment had been misrouted. I hired Diego Silva barely out of design school because his mock-ups solved problems we didn't even realize were costing us clients. My son Eli was 12 when I started at Glenmore. By the time he graduated from college, we had tripled our staff, opened 2 satellite branches, and brought in $5.8 million in annual revenue, all without losing the family feeling that made the team worth coming back to each morning. My wife Margaret, God bless her, held it all together at home. She never complained when I missed anniversaries or spent another weekend rewriting supply chain proposals at the kitchen table. She'd pour me a cup of chamomile and whisper, "You're building something that matters, Walt. Keep going." I clung to that belief for 16 years. We had seen 3 CEOs come and go before Ron arrived. And while each brought changes, some good, some frustrating, they respected what we had built. None of them questioned the value of relationships or the power of trust. When Glenmore was acquired by Altura Group, a New York-based investment firm with ambitions to scale, I didn't panic. I figured the numbers would speak for themselves, and that integrity, though quiet still, carried weight. But things began to shift. The new leadership didn't ask how we managed double-digit retention while other divisions bled clients. They didn't ask why our emergency response team could reroute a delayed shipment in under 2 hours. Instead, they sent in efficiency consultants with flowcharts and buzzwords, people who thought loyalty was just a cost center and experience a liability. Meetings were no longer about client stories, but about metrics and margins. They wanted leaner teams, faster turnover, and cheaper labor. 2 weeks before I was let go, Ron requested a report on all our top-tier clients. I gave him everything: contract values, renewal cycles, opportunity forecasts, but I didn't include what no spreadsheet could capture. How I once drove 4 hours to deliver uniforms to a burn unit after a fire destroyed a shipment. How I stood at the back of a funeral home when a client's wife passed away just to show I cared. Those things in their eyes were intangible. In mine, they were everything. So when I sat across from Ron that day, knowing my immune system was still recovering from chemo, knowing my energy was at its lowest in years, and heard him speak with all the warmth of an automated voice message, it hit me not because I was shocked, but because deep down, I had seen it coming. The world had changed, and I was no longer seen as the man who had saved their division. I was just a number. But they didn't account for one thing. I hadn't built those relationships for Glenmore. I had built them with people for people, and people remember who showed up when it mattered. The fatigue started slowly: missed alarms in the morning, headaches I couldn't shake, a weight behind my eyes that made everything feel distant, dulled. At first, I chalked it up to stress. We were in the middle of renegotiating 3 major contracts, and I had been flying back and forth between Denver, El Paso, and Sacramento almost every other week. But when Margaret caught me asleep at the dining table with a full cup of coffee in my hand and a client call still going on speakerphone, she knew something wasn't right. So did I. The diagnosis came a week later: stage 2 lymphoma. Manageable, treatable, but still cancer. At 56, I wasn't naive. I'd seen friends with this fight, some win, some not. And yet my first thought wasn't about my health or even my family. It was about Glenmore, about how the division would cope if I had to step back. I had become so entangled with the business, its people, its rhythm, its demands, that imagining life outside it felt like picturing the world without gravity. Everything would fall apart. I made a decision most wouldn't understand. I told almost no one. Just Margaret, my son Eli, and Lisa, my most trusted team lead. I began chemo quietly, booking sessions early in the mornings and showing up to the office right after. Pale, nauseous, but determined not to let it show. I'd sit in meetings while hiding the tremble in my hands under the table, excuse myself during lunch hours to lie down in the back of my car, and review reports with blood pressure so low the room would sometimes tilt. But I showed up every single day. I told myself this was temporary, that if I could just get through 6 rounds, I'd bounce back stronger, that I owed it to the people who had given everything to build what we had. But the truth was, I kept going because I was afraid, not just of the cancer, but of becoming invisible. I had seen how quickly older employees were restructured, how decades of service could be erased with a single email from corporate. I knew if I appeared weak or even absent for too long, they'd find someone younger, cheaper, faster, someone with sharper suits and shinier slide decks. So I kept my illness tucked inside a folder marked personal, stored under a stack of quarterly revenue projections and client strategy roadmaps. The irony, of course, was that I was fighting for a company that had already begun moving on from me. Ron didn't speak to me directly after his first month in the role. He preferred updates through charts and forwarded memos. He never asked about team morale, never questioned why so many clients only renewed after a personal visit from me, and never attended the Friday briefings we had upheld as a tradition for over a decade. But I told myself again and again that if I could just hold the line, If I could carry my weight long enough for the company to see me through this chapter, everything would settle. I was wrong. The day after my fourth chemo session, I landed in San Jose at 8:00 a.m. for an emergency meeting with a longtime school district client who was considering a competitor. I hadn't eaten in 24 hours, had barely slept, and had lost nearly 15 pounds in the last month. But I still walked into that conference room, smiled through the pain, and won the contract back by reminding them what Glenmore had always stood for: dependability, humanity, and follow-through. They shook my hand with respect. That night, I threw up twice in the airport bathroom and missed my connecting flight home. Margaret had to drive to Phoenix and pick me up at midnight. She said nothing, but the look in her eyes said everything. And still, I didn't stop. Because I believed, foolishly perhaps, that loyalty meant something, that if I showed up when I was broken, they'd remember when I was whole. That if I gave them everything, they wouldn't let me fall. But cancer strips you down not just physically, but emotionally. It leaves you raw, and as the months passed and Ron's silence deepened, as recognition faded and the office began humming with new hires whose names I didn't know and whose eyes avoided mine in the hallway, I realized something painfully clear. To them, I had become a liability, wrapped in legacy. I was no longer seen as the man who had kept the division alive when it nearly folded in 2009, who had delivered growth year after year, who had brought in clients not with discounts but with trust. I was now the aging manager with tired eyes and a disappearing presence, a reminder of an older version of the company that no longer fit their future-forward vision. And so, I kept quiet. I swallowed my pride with the same pills I used to keep the nausea at bay. I told myself this wasn't the end, that if I could just hang on a little longer, they'd see me for what I had been and not for what they feared I was becoming. But what I didn't know, not yet, was that they had already written me out of the future. The morning after I was let go, I sat in the quiet stillness of my home office, staring at a dark computer screen, as if it might blink back to life and tell me this had all been a misunderstanding. The chemo fog still clung to my body like a second skin, but this time, the heaviness in my chest wasn't from medication, it was from absence. For the first time in 16 years, my inbox didn't buzz with requests, updates, or client questions. My calendar, once a grid of overlapping appointments and deadlines, was empty. And the silence, so total, felt like judgment. Margaret brought me a cup of coffee extra cream, just how I liked I, and placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, the same way she did when I returned home after long flights or hard losses. "What are you thinking?" she asked, her voice cautious, not wanting to prod too hard into a space I hadn't yet named. I looked out the window, watching the wind stir the leaves on the elm tree we planted the year Eli was born. And I said quietly, "They don't understand what they've done." What surprised me wasn't the pain, though. It was sharp and fresh, and lodged somewhere between my ribs it was the clarity. For months, I had operated in a fog of side effects and denial, convincing myself that loyalty was enough to preserve my place, that integrity would earn a seat at the table, even if my body was failing me. But now, stripped of the illusion that I mattered to Glenmore beyond my utility, I saw it all for what it was. They had been planning this long before I ever missed a step. I powered up my personal laptop not. The company issued one I had left behind on that last day, and opened a file I hadn't touched in years, my personal contacts list. It wasn't a spreadsheet filled with revenue figures or quarterly trends. It was names, numbers, birthdays, preferences, handwritten thank you notes scanned in from clients who had become friends over time. I didn't know what I would do yet, but I knew one thing with certainty. I hadn't built those relationships for a brand. I'd built them one handshake, one late night delivery, one act of follow through at a time. And I wasn't going to pretend they didn't exist now just because Glenmore wanted to erase me. At 9:42 that morning, my phone rang. It was Diane, the procurement director from Clearview Financial, one of our largest accounts, and someone I'd worked with since her firm had 20 employees and a coffee machine that broke every other week. "Walter, please tell me this is a mistake. We just got a generic message about leadership changes, and I had to call." I took a breath, unsure of how much to say, and replied, "It's not a mistake. I was let go yesterday." There was a pause just long enough to register disbelief, anger, maybe something else. "Who's taking over your accounts?" she asked. "I don't know." They didn't say. Well, she muttered, tapping her pen, a nervous habit I'd come to recognize over the years. Our renewal is coming up in 6 weeks, and to be honest, the board only stuck with Glenmore last time because of you. After the call, I didn't move. I just sat there, the phone still warm in my hand, the words echoing louder than I expected. I hadn't asked her to say that. I hadn't made a pitch, but it told me everything I needed to know. What I had built still mattered, even if Glenmore didn't see it. That afternoon, I got a text from Diego, my former design lead. Emergency meeting. Ron's asking for all your client contact info. No one's giving him straight answers. What's going on? I didn't reply. By evening, I had 3 missed calls from executives who, just a week ago, had only ever spoken to me through filtered agendas and bullet points. Their voicemails sounded panicked, vague references to client confusion, unexpected instability, and urgent requests to touch base. I listened to each one carefully, then deleted them without a word. That night, I opened a fresh spreadsheet, this time not to track accounts or shipments, but possibilities. I listed every company that had tried to recruit me over the years, every conversation I'd brushed aside out of loyalty, and every competitor who had once said, "If you ever get tired of Glenmore, give me a call." And as I sat at the kitchen table, with the scent of Margaret's lemon chicken floating in from the oven and the soft hum of the dishwasher behind me, I made a decision. I wasn't going to fight for my old position. I wasn't going to chase their validation or plead for recognition. I had already earned that through years, through illness, through sacrifice. What I needed now wasn't revenge. What I needed was a new beginning on my own terms. 3 days after I was let go, the texts turned into calls. Ron, who hadn't spoken more than a sentence to me in the last 6 weeks of my employment, had suddenly found urgency in his tone. At first, I let them go to voicemail. Then, after the 5th missed call, I listened not out of curiosity, but to confirm what I already suspected. "Walter, we need to talk. There are concerns," he said. His voice clipped, the forced calm of someone trying to sound in control while the ground shifts beneath them. "Some of our key accounts are pushing back. There's confusion about the transition, and the board is asking questions." I sat at my desk, phone in one hand, a notepad in the other, the names of every major client I'd ever worked with already organized by priority, renewal, date, and contact history. I hadn't made a single outbound call, hadn't tried to undermine anyone, but the people I had built trust with over contracts, yes, but more often over hospital visits, late-night emergencies, and unexpected funeral shad noticed my absence, and they weren't willing to pretend it didn't matter. Later that day, I met Jerry Mathers for coffee. Jerry had once been CFO of Glenmore, before Altura Group pushed him out in their first wave of executive realignments. He still had contacts inside. After 2 sips of black coffee and a glance around the cafe, he leaned forward and said, "Ron's in a full-blown panic. Clearview and Redfield Medical both submitted formal letters stating they won't renew unless you're involved, and Ron's telling the board you're sabotaging him." I felt a flicker of anger, but it passed, quickly replaced by something colder, more focused. "I haven't called a single client," I said, almost to myself. "I know that," Jerry replied, "but he's building a case to claw back your severance, saying you're violating your agreement." That night, I forwarded the voicemail to Paul Henderson, a longtime friend and contract attorney. He called the next morning, his voice steady but sharp. "Walter, this is a bluff. I reviewed your paperwork. You never signed a non-solicitation clause, and your non-compete is limited to direct employment with a named competitor for 6 months. Clients can follow you. That's their right. It was a strange thing realizing I had more leverage unemployed, sick, and in recovery than I ever had inside the company I helped build. Not because I threatened anyone, but because when you build something real, when you show up consistently, protect people when it's inconvenient, and never hide behind titles, those relationships don't evaporate the moment your badge gets deactivated." A few hours later, an email popped into my inbox from Janini, your operations lead, still at Glenmore. Subject line, "You should see this." Attached was an internal presentation from 2 weeks before my termination. It was Ron's full restructuring plan meticulously outlined, with slides projecting a 22% increase in profit if they replaced experienced staff with entry-level hires and raised client pricing by 15%. My role was marked for elimination regardless of current performance. Worse, there was a list of 5 additional employees, including Lisa and Diegoset, for termination within the next quarter. Their only offense? Being associated with me. I printed the entire deck and sat in silence for several minutes, the words blurring at the edges as my mind wrestled with the scale of what had been set in motion long before my final meeting. Margaret stood behind me, reading over my shoulder. "They were planning to erase all of it," she whispered. "They think they already have," I replied. The next morning, I picked up the phone and called Daniel Beck, CEO of Everlane Supply Group, a smaller competitor who had reached out twice over the years, asking if I'd ever considered jumping ship. "I heard what happened," he said before I could even introduce myself. "Their loss. If you're interested, I'd still like to make a place for you here." I paused only long enough to ask the question that had been waiting on the tip of my tongue for days. What if I wanted to bring my team? 5 people. They're the best I've ever worked with. "Done," he said without hesitation. "I'll have offer letters sent over by end of day." That afternoon, I called Lisa, then Diego, then the others, each of them confused at first, then silent, then committed, one by one, the moment I shared the plan and the truth about Glenmore's intentions. I didn't ask them to follow me. I simply gave them the facts and the choice. All 5 said yes. By the end of that week, we had formal offers, signed letters, and resignation notices prepared. I hadn't made a scene. I hadn't posted a single word on social media, but I had planted the seeds of something stronger, something built on loyalty freely given, not extracted through fear. And when I sat down that Friday evening looking over a simple document titled Client Retention Strategy, Everlane Q3, I didn't feel victorious. I felt peaceful. I hadn't burned a single bridge, but I had begun building new ones, stronger, wiser, and mine to walk across this time. The Monday after we all officially resigned from Glenmore, I didn't wake to dread or bitterness. I woke early, made strong coffee, and watched the sun rise from my porch like I used to when Eli was in high school. And I still believed I had time on my side. There was no noise, no tension, no inbox filled with empty meetings, just the quiet certainty that I had taken back something I didn't even realize I had lost: ownership of my time and control over what came next. I hadn't gone on a revenge campaign. I hadn't spoken ill of anyone publicly. But word travels faster than intention in this industry, and by midweek, every one of Glenmore's 5 largest clients had reached out, not because I called them, but because no one else had. They weren't asking for updates or proposals. They were asking where I'd gone and whether they could come with me. I met Diane from Clearview for lunch at a quiet place just off I-17, the same diner where we'd finalized our very first contract 10 years earlier. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We're not renewing with Glenmore," she said before the menus even hit the table. "The question is where we're going next." I held her gaze, choosing my words carefully. "I'm not legally allowed to solicit anything right now," I said. "But if I were to start fresh, with the right people and values intact, I think we build something worth trusting again." She smiled, nodding. That's all I needed to hear. By Friday, similar conversations had unfolded with Redfield Medical, Oakmark Logistics, and Northwest Union Bank. None had received a single call from Glenmore's new leadership, not even an email. The silence from the very company that once preached efficiency spoke volumes, and the clients, like my team, were already halfway out the door. That weekend, Glenmore's board chair, Eleanor Reese, emailed me directly. "Walter, we underestimated the situation. The board is concerned. We'd like to discuss bringing you back. Full autonomy. Senior VP title. Name your terms." I didn't respond. Instead, I scheduled onboarding for my new team at Everlane Supply Group, whose office still smelled of fresh paint and optimism. The offer Daniel extended had remained generous: a senior role, equity participation, and full control over client relationships. No interference, no quotas based on nonsense metrics, just trust in my judgment. Within 3 weeks, all 5 of our former clients had formally transitioned to Everlane, citing loss of relationship integrity and leadership instability at Glenmore. I hadn't pressured them. I simply did what I'd always done, told the truth, and followed through. The final blow came unexpectedly, but not undeservedly. One morning, as I was reviewing our Q4 pipeline projections, Daniel walked into my office holding a tablet. "You'll want to see this," he said. The headline on the screen read, "Glenmore Uniform Solutions reports Q3 collapse. CEO resigns amid revenue crisis." The article detailed how their core business, once anchored by long-term accounts I had spent a decade nurturing, had shrunk by 38%, and their projected margins had cratered. Ron had stepped down, and the board had begun seeking outside consultation for restructuring again. But this time, there was no legacy team left to save them. They had dismantled what they didn't understand and paid the price. A few days later, I received a LinkedIn message from Thomas, their remaining CFO. "The board is meeting next week to discuss recovery strategies. Your name came up. Would you consider a conversation?" I closed the message without typing a word. Instead, I finalized Everlane's newest proposal for Clearview's national expansion, watched as Lisa presented design innovations that left the client team speechless, and listened as Diego sketched out our next product line on a whiteboard filled with energy and purpose. Later that month, Daniel pulled me aside. "We're expanding, and we're acquiring Glenmore's Western division. They're too weak to resist the offer. But I didn't want to sign anything until I talked to you." I paused for a long time, not out of indecision, but out of quiet reflection. "Do it," I said at last. "Just make sure the right people end up in the right places. And don't take their failure personally. They never saw the value in what we built, not until it was gone." The acquisition was completed within 2 weeks. The press release called it a strategic alignment, but those of us who had lived it knew the truth. It wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. We hadn't taken back what was ours. We had simply rebuilt it somewhere better. 1 year to the day after I walked out of Glenmore with a cardboard box and a shredded sense of worth, I drove past the building where it had all started. The Glenmore logo had been removed. The new sign read, "Everlane West Division." Inside, the lights were on. My team was there. The same people they tried to erase were now leading the next generation forward. I didn't go in. I just sat in my car for a while, watching the employees file out with coffee mugs and backpacks, smiling and talking as if something good was waiting for them tomorrow. And as I drove home, with the window cracked and spring air brushing against my face, I thought about the journey, the cancer, the dismissal, the silence, the rebuilding. I didn't need an apology. I didn't need a headline. And I didn't need Ron to know what had happened. Because some victories don't shout, they just last. Several weeks after the acquisition, the days began to feel familiar again, not in the way they once had at Glenmore, filled with noise and deadlines that never ended, but with a steadier rhythm that came from building something intentional. Our team had settled into the new offices. Laughter returned to the hallways. And for the first time in years, I looked forward to Mondays not because they were easy, but because they belonged to something we were shaping, not surviving. One morning, as I sat in my office preparing a proposal for a new healthcare network in Nevada, an email landed in my inbox with no subject line, just a sender, Eleanor Reese. I opened it slowly, already sensing the weight it would carry. Her message was brief, but carefully worded. "Walter, the situation at Glenmore has deteriorated further. Altura is dissolving remaining operations. The board unanimously believes only you can stabilize what's left. We are prepared to offer you full authority CEO title, equity stake, board seat, complete autonomy. Please consider returning. Name your terms." I stared at the screen for a long moment, not out of surprise, but because of the memory it stirred the cold meeting room, the unsigned get well card still sitting in the bottom drawer of a desk I never cleared out, and the sound of my own footsteps echoing through a hallway I had helped fill with meaning. Later that afternoon, I called a meeting with my core team, Lisa, Diego, Jerry, and the others, because I believed in transparency, and because I owed them the truth. "I've been asked to return to Glenmore," I said plainly. "CEO, full power. Their offer is generous, and they're desperate." The room fell into silence, not the kind born from fear or uncertainty, but the quiet knowing shared by people who had already made peace with the past. Janine smiled, softly but surely. "Too little, too late." Lisa nodded. "We didn't come with you for a title. We came for a purpose." And in that moment, I realized I didn't need to wrestle with the decision. It had already been not in a contract or compensation package, but in the way we had shown up for each other when no one else did. That evening, I sat down at my desk, opened a blank email, and typed 6 words that carried the full weight of my journey. Thank you. I must respectfully decline. Then I turned off the monitor, stepped outside, and watched the last light of day soften across the rooftops. Margaret was in the kitchen making her grandmother's roast, and Eli had called from Seattle just an hour earlier to share that his latest design had been selected for a landmark project in the city. The world hadn't stopped turning. It had simply turned in a better direction. A week later, headlines announced that Glenmore's final assets had been absorbed by larger firms, its name retired, its offices shuttered. There were no press conferences, no farewell ceremonies, just a footnote in the financial reports and a void where trust used to live. But at Everlane West, our numbers climbed steadily. Clients stayed not because we chased them, but because we listened. The team expanded slowly, intentionally, with people who believed in the quiet power of consistency. And the culture we built together couldn't be captured in quarterly slides or shareholder pitches. It lived in the way we treated each other, and in the legacy of every late night and early morning that had brought us here. I never got revenge in the way people expect. I never raised my voice. I never stormed out. I simply did the one thing they never saw coming. I kept building. And this time, I built something that no one could take from Minot because it was too protected, but because it was too human. If this story touched something in you, if you've ever felt discarded, overlooked, or quietly replaced despite giving your best, know this: your worth is not defined by what they remember. It's defined by what you choose to carry forward. If you've ever come back from something they thought would end you, leave a comment, share your story, and don't forget to subscribe, because your story might be the next one we tell.